Good afternoon, everyone. Today it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Larry Summers. Professor Summers is one of the most influential economists of our time. He has helped to shape national and international economic policy over the past 2 decades. Professor Summers received his bachelor's degree in economics from MIT. He went on to begin his graduate PhD work at Harvard University. He actually joined the MIT faculty while he was finishing up his PhD at Harvard. And in 1983, Professor Summers became one of the youngest people in history to receive tenure from Harvard University. Professor Summers has had an outstanding academic career, mentoring numerous graduate students who've gone on to make their own significant impacts in the field of economics. He received the Waterman Award from the National Science Foundation, which recognizes a young scientist whose originality, creativity, and innovation help to have a significant impact within their own field. He also received the Clark Medal, which is awarded to the outstanding young American economist under the age of 40. In 1991, Professor Summers joined the World Bank as a chief economist. He then served in numerous roles at the Department of Treasury, and in 1999 was confirmed as Secretary of the Treasury for the United States, where he worked within the administration for a significant paydown of the U.S. national debt, as well as to expand Medicare and Social Security trust funds. In 2001, Professor Summers became the president of Harvard University, where he undertook an ambitious program to expand the faculties, to enhance the commitment to life sciences, and also to ensure that the brightest minds could be recruited to Harvard and that they would be able to be at Harvard through the Harvard Financial Aid Initiative. Finally, in 2009, Professor Summers became the director of the National Economic Council under the Obama administration. He was a key advisor to President Obama and has served in key decision-making for all of the major economic policies of this administration. And we are eager to hear from Professor Summers about decision-making during challenging times. Professor Summers, thank you so much.
Thank you. Larry's asked me to start out by asking him a question, and I want to do it at the broadest sense. So everything Larry has done, when we look back in history, his role in the last 2 years, between 2008 and 2010, in terms of stopping a world that was heading to economic possible collapse, downturns of massive amounts in the U.S. and other countries, he stepped in a role that few people will ever hopefully face in their lives, and played a critical role in what U.S. institutions and world institutions did. It's too easy for me to drift 100 different questions to Larry. For those of us who want to know about decision making, what can you help people understand when you're asked to serve in a role in a crisis like that? Advice and perspective on how you made decisions, things that you would advise people who hopefully never have to face the choices that this administration did, but may in their first year in office. Help us understand moving your role in this crisis here.
Let me just, Bob, before I turn to your question, say how glad I am to be at the public health school. I thought when I was president of the university that you all were very lucky in how truly important your mission was. And I said many times something that I still believe today, that when people look back at this moment in history, they're likely to see two things as defining of our era: the process of globalization, the integration of the world, the rise of what had been called the third world on the one hand, and the tremendous march of science, especially in the life sciences, that was changing our concepts of healthcare, that was changing our concepts of what it meant to be human. And the place in a great university where those two streams come together to forge what I think is an incredibly important river is the School of Public Health. And so I think what you do is very much at the center of what a great university should be about. And that's why all of this attention on global health that it's receiving, I think, is so fortunate. I think that you are very fortunate in your dean, who I first got to know as a policy practitioner. There are a lot of people who know how to count and analyze very well. There are a lot of people who really care. There are not so many people who fall in both categories, and your dean is one of them. And that makes him an inspiring example for people in the public health field, and I think very well situated to lead this endeavor. I would say that I'm very grateful for that introduction. I was looking to see if you were reading that all from somewhere, and I couldn't find it, and you got it. I don't think my mother could have gotten it quite as accurately, and I'm not sure my mother would have had quite as much of a bias towards charity in what you chose to say and what you didn't. Thank you very much. I would say one of the things that I learned later than some other things in life was that it is very hard to be effective in the world by being right alone. That broad currents of public opinion within institutions and within countries, as they manifest themselves in politics, have a very, very important impact on what happens. And Bob's work over many years on public opinion, on thinking about healthcare, has had real impacts in improving our understanding, and because of that improved understanding, a capacity to generate better outcomes. It was a daunting fall in 2008. Things that frankly seemed close to inconceivable happened. Lehman Brothers fell. AIG was on the brink of failure and would have failed without a massive intervention. Some of our largest companies were unable to roll their debt over for a period of more than a day or 3 days without government assistance. The economy was in free fall. In fact, if you look at the stock market, it fell by more between October of 2008 and March of 2009 than it did in the first 6 months after 1929. If you look at global trade, it fell at a sharper rate during those first 6 months. If you look at the path of unemployment and job loss, it was at a more rapid rate than it had ever been previously. So it was a moment where the abyss was coming increasingly into view. For me, as an ex-Treasury Secretary, it would not in normal times have been obvious that working as the President's economic advisor in the White House was a thing that I would choose to do. But in the context of that moment and in the context of that president, it was a very, very easy decision. That moment, a moment of such severe financial crisis for the United States. I had, during my time in the 90s, been very engaged with a whole range of financial crises in Mexico, in Thailand, Indonesia, Korea, Russia, Brazil, but not one in my own country. And it's very different when it's your own country. And that president, President Obama is a remarkable man. All our presidents are remarkable. They wouldn't be elected if they were not remarkable. But President Obama had, on the one hand, a capacity to set a vision, to look past the immediate, to be prepared to transcend. And on the other hand, President Obama has an extraordinary pragmatic calm, a willingness to hear all the facts, listen to judgments, and make a decision, and then live with the consequences of that decision. I had got to know him reasonably well during the campaign, as I had advised on financial things. So the combination of the moment and the president made it an obvious decision for me that the right thing to do was to return to Washington. I remember very soon after I had accepted the position, as I was thinking about what I was going to be trying to do, and what the objective was, that it came to mind an experience that I had had a year or two before with my twin daughters. My twin daughters had studied advanced placement U.S. history, and I had talked to them about where economic things had figured in their course. And the answer was it was sort of an on and off thing. They learned a little bit about the great debates about the National Bank of the United States in the 19th century. I asked them about the 1982 recession, which for me was a very big deal, was not mentioned in their course. I asked them about the 1987 stock market crash, 20% in one day, big deal, not mentioned in their course. I asked them about the depression of the 1930s, 6 weeks of study. And I realized at that point that in some sense I knew how we would know if we had succeeded. If these events were the stuff of history courses in 2040 and 2050, they were not going to be the stuff of happy history courses in 2040 or 2050, in the same way that the 1930s and that for which they were a precursor is not well remembered in history courses today. If, on the other hand, these events proved to be the object of much study by economists, the reason for passage of some significant legislation, but not the kind of transcendent historic events that students will be taught a generation from now, then that would mean that we had contained the situation and contained the situation effectively. And so I kept that as a touchstone, as a goal in mind, in all the advice that I provided President Obama. I made another judgment, again, not a judgment that would have been unique to me, but another judgment that shaped, two other judgments really, that shaped the kind of strategic approach that we took. The first was that this was a situation of a kind that occurs 2 or 3 times a century, where the market system was self-destabilizing rather than self-stabilizing. Normally what we talk about in economics courses is how the market's self-stabilizing. You've all heard this in some form or other. You have too much wheat, the price of wheat goes down, people eat more bread, farmers plant more wheat, and plant less wheat, and the situation re-equilibrates. There's too much demand for credit, the interest rate goes down. There's too little demand for credit, the interest rate goes down, people invest more, they save a little less, and the market re-equilibrates. This was a situation where things were working the other way. The reasons are complicated. The simplest example to think about is somebody who's bought stock on margin. So you bought a stock on margin, the stock goes down. Used to be you put $50 up and your broker lent you $50 and you had $100 of stock. Now the stock goes down to $75. Guess what? Your broker's not feeling so good about their loan. And the broker tells you you have to put up more money or they're going to sell off the collateral. Not everybody can put off more money, so the collateral gets sold. Notice what's happening. The price is going down, and when the price is going down, the demand is going down as well. That kind of vicious cycle, falling prices, more selling, falling prices faster. Banks holding assets, getting in more and more trouble, lending less, making the prices of assets go down faster. The economy, depending on the flow of credit depending on the economy, both getting worse, cycling. The whole thing was like a vicious cycle. The whole thing was like a avalanche. It was the opposite of the kind of self-stabilizing system that an economy had. That made me realize that in a situation like this, the dangers are of doing too little rather than of doing too much. For those involved in medical care, there are things you will do with a patient who, if you do nothing, is likely to die in 48 hours that would seem much too risky to do in normal circumstances. But if the path without action leads to disaster, the errors should be on the side of doing too much rather than on the side of doing too little. And so the first broad judgment that shaped the advice I gave President Obama, that shaped President Obama's view, was let's have our errors be of trying too hard, of doing too many things, not of doing too little. The second judgment that President Obama made, that we made, was, in the phrase I liked to use at the time, confidence is the cheapest form of stimulus. That there was an important psychological element in all of this, that if everybody thinks that there's not going to be any money left in a bank, then for sure there won't be any money left in the bank because everyone will run on the bank. If everyone thinks that they're going to lose their job, no one will spend any money and everyone will lose their job. So in a process where you have too little confidence, it is essential to think about the resumption of confidence. That also influenced a different judgment. A lot of thought went into what President Obama was going to do immediately upon taking office. And just as President Roosevelt had been successful in his inaugural address and right afterwards in marking a discontinuity and providing confidence, so also President Obama sought to provide confidence. These kinds of strategic judgments then informed a whole set of judgments at the next level. A judgment that since the private sector was not borrowing money on a significant scale, the private sector was paying back money because people felt overextended, and so there was, to use the economic term, pervasive deleveraging underway, that if the private sector was stopping borrowing, government needed to be prepared to borrow in order to spend itself and in order to increase the purchasing power of state and local governments and of the private sector. Hence, the Recovery Act. At one level, it was very large, close to $800 billion. At another level, compared to the scale of the American economy or compared to the scale of underemployed resources, it was much smaller. Similarly, a very difficult judgment. Should the United States bail out the automobile industry? We're a capitalist country. We're a country that reveres the market system. The companies had been badly managed for a generation. They had made all kinds of mistakes. Frankly, their shareholders and their management didn't deserve much. And the people who'd lent them money had probably made a mistake, and they'd been gambling by receiving a high yield when they did it. The other hand, this was an extraordinary event. Car sales in total in the United States, if you looked between 1997 and 2007, fluctuated between about 14 million cars and about 17 million cars. And car sales had fallen to 10 million cars. And so even if you were a well-run car company, you were facing very substantial financial pressure. So the question was, if you let a car company fail, there were going to be massive unemployment insurance costs. There were going to be massive costs for its pensions. Either you were going to have the set of people who depended on the automobile industry do without health insurance, or somebody from the government was going to be paying for health insurance. So failure was not an inexpensive option. There were three choices. They could be let to just go and go through a private sector bankruptcy, and there would be some factories that would be kept open, but the companies would be dismembered. That was one option. Another option, which was the one the companies favored, was that the government could extend them loans on a substantial scale to give them a chance to keep operating because of what had happened. And the third option was that they could go bankrupt. Their shareholders could be wiped out. Their debts could be written down very substantially. And the government could then step in as the so-called debtor in possession financier. The government could provide them the new lending that they required, because right after you've gone bankrupt, nobody in the private sector is going to loan you a great deal of money. In the end, that was the choice that we made. There were people who thought that it was too destructive of confidence, because who would buy a car from a bankrupt company? There were other people who thought that it was rewarding failure and rewarding lack of success. But we felt that just as there are unintended victims in war, there are unintended beneficiaries in the response to financial crisis. That latter decision illustrates what is less true in textbooks about decision making, but in my experience is usually true in practice, which is that you're engaged in a kind of balancing exercise, and that often it's not just yes or no, but it's trying to find, you've got option A, which has some tremendous benefits, but has very large costs. You've got option B, which avoids most of the costs, but doesn't get you the benefits. And sometimes you just have to choose between A and B, but often what you try to do is find an option that gets you 80% of the benefits of option A with 30% of the costs of option A. So by choosing bankruptcy, we sacrificed a little bit of ability to add confidence to the situation, and gained much more legitimacy in terms of what we were doing relative to a market system and in terms of containing the government's costs, because the government wasn't having to pay in order to pay off bondholders. In other cases, we made a judgment, and this was one of the things we were most criticized for, that with respect to the banks, if we tried to make bondholders be responsible, the consequences for confidence were going to be so shattering that everyone would be worse off. Were we right in that judgment? I think we probably were, ex post, but one will never know. And it has been controversial. But the point is that I think the best approaches to decision making and leadership involve having a general orientation to the problem. Ours was, let's do too much, not too little. Let's seek to add confidence to the situation. And then within that, trying to make careful technocratic judgments on a sort of point-by-point basis with respect to the particular issues involved. That was the approach we took at my level. Obviously, for the president, there was less involvement in all of the technical details and more involvement in making sure that the American people were able to see a better future. One of the things that he insisted on from the day he was elected was that he had not run for president in order to lift the economy out of a ditch. Indeed, he didn't know when he announced he was running for president that the economy was going to go into a ditch in terms of this crisis. And he was not prepared to have his historic opportunity be directed entirely at lifting the economy out of the ditch. And that's why even as he was working on the recovery, he maintained a focus on questions like energy efficiency, questions like universalizing the availability of health insurance, questions like making information technology available on a large scale to health professionals at a time when it has to be some kind of national embarrassment that the average 7-Eleven has more information technology than the average doctor's office.
Larry's agreed to, this could be a long discussion here. Larry's agreed to take questions from you. If you can identify just who you are, we have mics for that. I want to move it around so people have a real chance. As I said before, when history is written, I don't think it's going to take 40 years to realize the role Larry and a small number of people played in shaping this very incredible response. And I want people to feel that they had a chance to have some interaction here. Who's first?
My name is Anders Wittfeldt. I'm a doctoral student in epidemiology. My question is, when you have an economy that's in a vicious cycle and you need to credibly signal that the political leadership are optimistic about the situation, you need that signal to be credible, that people don't believe the politicians are just saying that because they believe that will stop the cycle. What is your thinking about being open about the process of trying to induce confidence? Does that in any way undermine the objective?
It's a very hard set of challenges. Basically, credibility breeds confidence. Optimistic statements breed confidence. Optimistic statements aren't always true. And so you have to find your way through the linguistics of that. And one of the things that I was always focused on as Secretary of the Treasury and focused on in the advice I've given others in a different way, focused on while I was president of Harvard, is I didn't want to ever say things that in an uncertain world would embarrass me 6 months later, given the range of things that could happen. And that's why one spends a lot of time crafting statements carefully. So to take one example, language is flexible. Take the example that I actually remember most vividly around these issues. When we bailed out Mexico, we committed to lend Mexico up to $20 billion from the United States and another 20-odd billion dollars from the IMF at a time when the Mexican economy was in extraordinary difficulty and faced the possibility of a default on its debt in 1994. And the question was, what should we say when asked, are you optimistic about the future of the Mexican economy? When, there was a market out there were a lot of people watching it, and, Mexican dollar-denominated debt was selling for 15 percentage points more than treasuries. So there was a market out there, and the market out there wasn't confident. On the other hand, if the U.S. government, which was lending money, had said, well, look at the market, they're not very optimistic, that would not have been hugely constructive in the situation. We worked for quite a number of hours on what Secretary Rubin would say when asked a question of that kind. And I don't remember exactly what we came up with, but it was something like this. Mexico's economic program should work if it is implemented vigorously and effectively as Mexico has committed. Well, notice a couple features of that. That's not, you don't feel bad when you hear that. The program should work. If the program doesn't work, well, we didn't quite say it would work, we said it should work. And we said it would work if Mexico vigorously and effectively implemented the program. And part of what the market had doubt about was whether Mexico would vigorously and effectively implement the program. But if you thought about being asked the question, if we did a little simulated Meet the Press, and I had that sentence, you wouldn't be able to get me off it, and you wouldn't be able to get me to a place where I was either trashing Mexico or a place where I was saying something that was in danger of looking foolish. If the Mexican, or, it's not that I care about looking foolish, but the United States only has one Secretary of the Treasury, and if he loses his credibility, that's therefore a quite large problem. And so you have to be very careful about preserving your credibility as an asset. And we would work hard before the president had a press conference or before any of us spoke about thinking about the questions that were likely to come up and seeking to craft answers that were straightforward, honest, and helpful. And it was a challenge.
Other questions? We need a mic right behind you.
Thank you very much. My name is Ashkan Afshin. I'm a postdoc at the Department of Epidemiology. As you know, probably for each decision we consider different components. One of them is the accuracy of the decision, and the other one is the speed of making that decision and whether this decision is in time or not. And there is a kind of trade between these two. In your decision making, actually, when do you reach to the conclusion that it is the time to make the decision, and with what level of uncertainty you make your decision usually?
I don't know that it's an extremely good question that you've just asked, and I can imagine epidemiological constructs. It takes 3 months to prepare a vaccine. The more science, the more time you spend before deciding on what exactly the vaccine is, the better targeted the vaccine will be to the disease. On the other hand, if you're late, the epidemic can spread. How do you trade it off? It's an issue that arises in many different contexts, and I don't know that there are hard and fast rules. One of the things I learned from Bob Rubin in the time that I worked with him was about the importance of maintaining optionality, maintaining the capacity to make choices. Bob had two habits from which I learned. The first was an insistence that you didn't do anything until it had been thought through reasonably carefully. So if you worked for Bob and you went to him and you said, Bob, the Treasury Department needs to instruct the IMF that, have its executive director instruct the IMF that XYZ. Bob would say, that's what you think? He'd say, yeah. He'd say, what are the 3 best reasons not to do that? And if you said, well, it's just obviously the right thing to do, he would say, let's have a meeting to discuss that because I want to hear a lot of people's views. We'll schedule the meeting 2 weeks from Thursday. If, however, you said, well, look, I've thought about it. The 3 reasons not to do it are 1, 2, 3. But on balance, the way I overcame objection number 1 was by thinking through the fact that if we didn't do it, such and such would happen. And if we didn't do it, such and such would happen. And the way in which I overcame concern number 2, and he provided some other reason that it made sense, he usually wouldn't let you get to reason number 3. And he'd say, it sounds like you've thought about this pretty carefully and you know more about it than I do, so do whatever, be careful, but do whatever you think is best. Well, you did after a while, and I have since followed this practice with people I work with. You did learn to think it through carefully. So I think the first rule is it's never a good idea to do anything because you are acting on your feeling and your gut and your strength and you haven't thought it through carefully. So, that's why if you're angry, it's always a good idea to wait an hour before you hit the send key on the email. That's why if you've got an urge because you're upset about something to pick up the phone and call somebody, you're usually better off waiting to see if you still have the urge the next day. There's a set of don't do anything that matters in heat. That's a kind of first aspect of it. The second is a really hard kind of problem, which is, where you just have to have judgment, and I don't think you can make it scientific. On the one hand, I've got 2 conflicting sets of anecdotes in my head, and I don't know how I actually balance them in any particular case, except by just following my instinct. I'm not sure I can reduce it to something scientific. One anecdote is, if it's not going to get better, do it quickly. So here's a lesson I learned as an administrator that I suspect Julio has learned. To relate to this, you have to put yourself in my perspective. Okay, I'm the president of the university. Professor X at the public health school, or postdoc X at the public health school, writes me a letter saying, a 2-page letter saying, there's such and such that's like going wrong at the public health school and it's a problem and I hope you'll look into it and I'm really concerned about it, and write some 2-page thing. What's the right way to handle it? If I write back the next day, "Dear Postdoc X, thank you very much for your letter. I appreciate your bringing your concerns to my attention. My colleagues and I will look into the matter you raised, and if there is some appropriate follow-up, we will come back to you. Sincerely yours, Lawrence Summers." It all feels very reasonable. I've answered, I've been courteous, I've been responsive. You can't really fault my letter. If I want to follow up, I can. If I judge the thing to be foolishness, I don't have to respond, all that. Now let's suppose that I wait 2 weeks. If I wait 2 weeks and I send that letter, it really feels kind of, I worked hard on sending my complaint to the president. Why the hell can't he say something about it? Hasn't he had 2 weeks? Why hasn't he learned anything? If I then say, I can't just send a form letter. I better actually learn something about it, so I can't really answer this poor letter because I don't have anything to say. So I'll ask somebody to look at it. And now it's a month. After a month, I've got to write a really good letter. I've really got to be knowledgeable. And if I'm not knowledgeable and ready after a month and I wait 2 months, then it's really got to be Sherlock Holmes meets the problem. So if the decision, so the first principle is, if the decision or if the action is not likely to improve with time, the situation will get worse with time, and you should just decide. You should just decide. If you employ somebody and the person's really not doing a very good job, and you sort of have seen it for 6 months and the person's just not doing a very good job, and you've warned them and they're not doing a very good job, you should either decide that I'm going to fire them, or you should decide, look, nobody's perfect and the person's got some real strengths and it'll be really hard to find anybody else, and I'm going to keep the person. But decide, because the decision's not going to get easier and better with the passage of time. It's not going to be easier to fire them after they've worked for you for another year. You probably know as much as you need to know about who they are. You just need to decide. So when the decision is not going to get better with the passage of time, it's usually best to decide quickly. Conversely, what's often true is that if there are no good choices, maybe it's a bad time to decide until you've thought about whether there's a way of expanding the menu. And if there's no reason to make a decision, then why do you need to make the decision right away? I sort of, some of you probably know Julie Shample, who works with me. I drive her crazy by carrying this principle to its logical extreme. I have a flight scheduled. I'm going to go to New York a week from Thursday for a trip. She asks me whether I want to take the 7 a.m. shuttle or the 8 a.m. shuttle. My view tends to be, well, I'll see how energetic I feel the day before. Why can't I keep the 7 o'clock shuttle and the 8 o'clock shuttle will both fly that day? Why can't I keep my options open? There's no cost. There's no real cost to waiting. We had a experience that we made Bob Rubin put in his book of there was a meeting which I was scheduled to go to in Malaysia on a certain Monday, Monday over Thanksgiving. It turned out that the Korean financial crisis hit on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. So it was a question whether I was going to be able, whether I should go to that meeting, since I was leading our international economic effort, and it was going to be hard to lead it from an airplane for 18 hours each way to Malaysia. We asked Bob on Thursday, did he think I should go or did he think we should send somebody else? He said, well, it's Thursday and whoever leaves isn't going to have to leave till Sunday, right? Right. So I don't want to think about it now. We asked the same question on Friday. He said, can't we think about it tomorrow? We asked the same question on Saturday, and he said, well, maybe we could have all the Treasury people go, and maybe we could have all the Treasury people stay. We could send somebody from the White House to the meeting. Let's think about it. On Sunday morning, he said, we called him and we asked him what he thought, and he said, well, what time's the flight leave? 6. So you have to leave the airport at 3. You have to leave your house for the airport at 3, right? This is to go halfway around the world to Malaysia. He said, well, why don't we check with the person in the White House to see if he'd be willing to leave at 3, and then if he is, then we'll know that if we want, we can send him. And at that point, I said, Bob, I don't think that we can ask a guy to be on standby for traveling around the world. If you think he should go, we can call him and ask him to go, but I don't think I'd be comfortable calling him and asking him to be on standby so you can have another 2 or 3 hours to think about it. And at that point, we got somebody else to do it. But we found somebody to do it. But the point is, there is a real benefit in preserving optionality for as long as you can. But I don't know quite how to make a science. I mean, I know how to make this. I know how to do the math of decision trees, where you calculate the expected value of perfect information, and you figure out whether it's worth drawing another ball from an urn to learn which of the 2 urns there are. I mean, I'm good on those math problems, and those math problems help form your intuition for the kinds of decisions that you make. But with respect to actual decisions in the real world, you have to sort of have some instinct that's formed. That's one of the reasons why I do not actually live by one of the principles that's often suggested to leaders or attributed to good leaders, which is don't look back. I actually do look back at decisions I've made because it seems to me that that's the best way to learn for future decisions that you're going to make.
One more.
Thank you, Professor Summers. That's actually a very good segue to the question I had for you, and it pertains
just
to
a quick introduction on you.
Oh, yes, please. I'm a postdoc in the Department of Nutrition, and I work with Dr. Fauzi. So my question was, is it possible, especially when you're making decisions in a rapidly changing situation, and in the case of the economic crisis, the goal is to get the economy growing again and hiring and all in the directions we would want. What is the tension between economic growth and environmental responsibility? And in particular, is there a way to have good economic growth and environmental responsibility, especially given also your views on regulation? And you've also obviously thought about the impact of regulations on economic growth, and I'm curious to know how you balance those at moments like this.
I think there are, it's a very good question. I think there are areas of synergy between economic and environmental things, and I think there are areas of conflict. I've got no doubt that where we subsidize the use of really dirty coal, and we use really dirty coal, that if we eliminate those subsidies, we will have a more efficient economy. And as we have a more efficient economy, we will also have cleaner air and better environmental values. I have very little doubt that there are a number of areas where, because of various behavioral factors, people don't make high return investments. When I was president at Harvard, we started a green bank program from the center of the university where schools or groups or anybody in the university who had a project that would have a high payoff, we would loan them money at 3%. And we found what was to me a surprising number of projects where you insulate something and it pays itself back in 2.5 years. And so the internal rate of return on that investment was very high. So there are certainly opportunities that go begging in the United States where you can improve the environment and improve economic growth. There is a tendency, which I think is unfortunately overdone in some circles, to go from what I just said, which I think is right, to the broader claim that stricter environmental regulation will always help the economy. And I think you do need to recognize that if you make people use more expensive fuels, the products they produce with those more expensive fuels will be more expensive. And that will have some adverse economic consequences, which doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. The environmental benefits might be worth it. But I think that just because there are some areas that are both good environmentally and good economically, it's a mistake to infer that all environmental protection that is attractive comes at a zero price or comes at a negative price because it makes the economy better. And one way I have of judging who I find credible on some of this and who I find ludicrously optimistic is, different people have different views, but there are a certain number of people who, when they make the case for why addressing global climate change will be good for the economy, they make the case so strongly that you think that if global climate change didn't exist, it would be a good idea to pretend that it did, so you could do all these great things for the economy. And whenever the case has the character that it would be good to pretend that there was a pollution problem even if there really wasn't, that's when I think somebody's usually pushing the argument a little too far into a kind of green theme that I'd be inclined not to believe.
2 minutes.
One more question and I'll answer it fast.
Yes. Our students are quick.
Can you just ask it?
Wait for the mic and just introduce yourself. We want you part of history here on the tape.
I'm Celia Rema I'm a postdoc here at Environmental Health. Just a really quick question. What do you think of the guy who portrayed you in The Social Network?
Good to see we're serious, scholarly here at the School of Public Health. I'm told that the Winklevi, when asked the same question, said the only problem with the scene is that Larry Summers was much less nice to us in person than he was in the movie. It has been said occasionally that I can be arrogant. If that is true, I probably was arrogant on that occasion. They came swaggering in with what I perceived as a great sense of entitlement, which I was not prepared to give them. And I didn't think what they were saying was enormously reasonable. And I probably made that very clear to them, as I'm told I sometimes can. So was it exactly accurate? No, I never told anybody to punch me in the face, as they did in the movie. Was the dialogue exactly things I would have or did say? Probably not. Was the impression left of arrogant students met a equally arrogant, older, slightly condescending university president accurate? Yes, it absolutely was.
We're going to have to thank Larry for this. This will be remembered by many people as a point in history, as many of the decisions that Larry was involved with actually become much clearer in their impacts. We are incredibly pleased he did this, and the effort for people in public health is to try to broaden an understanding of what goes into decisions at the time they have to be made. And that's what the series has been about, because some people in this room will be in those places someday. And we want people to be able to combine both the evidence, but also the things that go into the reality of decision making. Larry, again, thank you very much for taking time to be with us.